In today's session, we're going to be talking about zero trust and in specific to the Microsoft SC-100 Cybersecurity Architect certification, right? This is a key component of the certification, so let's dive a little bit deeper into here, right? So everything for zero trust evolves around Microsoft pillars, right? And there's three main pillars here, right? So the first one is assume a breach, right? So at some point, there is going to be a breach of some sort, right? And we want to architect from those traditional safe networks to more of the newer open networks that we see, right? We want to verify explicitly, right? So we want to reduce our attack surface on each asset. We want to use telemetry, monitoring, logging to give us all that visibility. And we want to move away from trust by default, right? So we're verifying everything explicitly. And then finally, well, we want to employ the principle of least privilege, right? We want to reduce our blast radius. So if something is compromised, something else doesn't get compromised, right? So we want to limit the blast radius, right? We want to make sure we're doing JIT, just-in-time access. So an example would be instead of having the SSH port open all the time, we may just open it from the hours of 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. in the evening for that user to access it, right? So just-in-time access. And then JEA is just enough access. So, for example, going back to our example of the VM, the host, right? That we only give them the user only SSH access to do certain things and nothing more. We want to be able to use risk-based policies that we're continuously evaluating that risk, and we want to be implementing adaptive access controls, dynamic things, right? For example, like if a user is accessing something, we want to check where that person's logging in from, add a little bit of context to that connection, right? And when we look at that zero trust, and when we're looking at Microsoft, we want to kind of like keep in the back of our mind this concept of moving, right? So we want to be moving away trust by default. By default, we don't want to be trusting anything in our environment, and we want to be doing trust by exception. So we always want to be explicitly giving that trust to someone. So that's that kind of notion of moving away from and moving to. And when we look at those pillars, you know, the actual zero trust pillars, that those three pillars, right? Where are we really applying them, right? And we're applying them across 7 different technology domain pillars, right? So we want to be able to apply zero trust at the identity level, right? So we're defining zero trust control planes here. Again, as I mentioned before, applying that least privilege principles, right? Only giving them access to what they need, right? And also, when we look at that users, we also need to be looking at the devices that those users are using, right? Those endpoints, right? Because these endpoints, just imagine if an organization had millions of employees all accessing the infrastructure in our environment, that creates a massive attack surface that can be exploited, right? So we want to be able to monitor and enforce device health across the board here. We also want to be applying zero trust at that securing of the applications, right? We want to make sure that our APIs and apps are all secure to which the data is consumed, right? We want to make sure that we're really discovering those shadow IT, like for specific departments doing their own stuff, right? We want to make sure what they're doing, get that visibility, and kind of stop it really, right? We want to make sure that we're ensuring that the right applications have the right permissions, okay? We want to control user actions, okay? On those specific applications, we want to validate security configurations, ensure there's no misconfigurations, make sure there's not deviating from any of those baselines. And again, that common theme about monitoring, telemetry, logging, right? We want to monitor the abnormal behavior of those applications, right? Moving on to the next technology pillar here, we have the data, right? So we want to be applying zero trust at the data, securing that. So that means classifying our data, labeling our data, performing encryption at rest. So that's encryption when the data is stored, and encryption in transit when that data is also moving, right? And we want to be able to restrict access to that data based on those above attributes of classify, label, and all that kind of good stuff, right? We also want to be doing secure zero trust and securing that infrastructure, right? So this actually represents some of our most critical threat vectors, right? We want to be assessing versions, assessing configurations, JIT access, detect attacks in real time, and automate everything, right? So we want to be proactive and automate the blocking and taking actions against any attacks that we see across our infrastructure, right? And then obviously, a fundamental technology pillar is the networking aspects of it. So we want to be applying zero trust, and the way we do that is applying networking controls, preventing lateral movement across the network, or another way of actually looking at it is east-west traffic, right? Essentially traffic that's moving across our own environment, right? And the way we kind of do this is we can provide segmentation, we can provide deeper micro segmentations, and just kind of like think about segmentation for a moment here in Azure. We can go all the way from subscriptions to resource groups to VPCs. So there's a whole level of hierarchical segmentation we can do there, right? We also want to do end-to-end encryption. We want to do monitoring and analytics, telemetry, that theme that keeps coming up. And just to kind of wrap it up here, that we want full visibility, automation, and orchestration with zero trust. We want to know exactly what is going on. And this actually means everything that we previously mentioned in the other technology pillars, right? And, and this is basically, if we look at this step number 7, right, the technology pillar here is all about making better trust decisions, right? We want to collect the data, the metrics, so we can act upon it, make decisions upon them, right? So that kind of like concludes that kind of like the technology pillars, the 3 zero trust principles applied across the 7 technology pillars, right? So if we shift kind of gears here, and we look at the kind of like the Azure products that we use to do our zero trust across the actual technology pillars, we have our IAM, right? So we have our identity access and management, Azure Active Directory. We also have endpoint and device security, right, which is the Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And then if we look at some of the infrastructure security components, we have Azure Arc, the ability to maintain, manage, and all that stuff, on-prem stuff. We have the Azure Firewall, we have the Azure WAF, DDoS protections, Azure Key Vault, Azure Bastion, right, the ability remotely to come into the environment to manage elements there in our infrastructure, right? Azure backups, express routes, and private links. Express routes is that dedicated means of actually going from on-prem into our Azure environment. Private link means having access to that Azure blob storage without traversing across the public internet. We can have those direct private links within our environment, right? And when we look at data protection, we've got Azure Purview, Compliance Manager. And then from a security operations perspective, we've got Microsoft Defender and Microsoft Sentinel, the SIEM, the SOAR, all that kind of good stuff from an ops perspective, right? And then, just kind of wrap up things here. We talk about zero trust, and then we can't, have that conversation without talking about traffic filtering and segmentation, right? So when we look at that segmentation and the filtering, we can do that at subnet levels. We can create security at the perimeter of our networks, right? Like, for example, DDoS solutions and IDS. We want to avoid exposure to the internet, right? So we want to make sure that we don't actually have unnecessary dedicated WAN links coming into our environment. We want to be able to use virtual network appliances, right? So think of those like those traditional security companies that offer firewall solutions, and now they're providing those solutions in the cloud environment. So we want to use these to complement some of the native Azure security components, right? So for example, an example may be that a vendor may actually have a next generation firewall. We may want to complement that with some Azure native security solutions like a WAF, like Microsoft's Azure WAF solution, right?